This is an Italian set of tools called a hammer and a hardy. These are both steel. And this is a method used by the Roman slaves way back in the day. So it's a very antique method, but it's a way to cut and shape the glass by fracturing it. And if you practice it, you can get very detailed little cuts with the little hammer down to the tiniest little piece. And traditionally they put it into a log because when you're doing this fracturing, the soft nature or expansive nature of the wood absorbs the impact of your strike with your hammer. So you're trying not to hit the steel and the hammer together. You want the glass always to be in between the two. But if you would put this, for example, into plaster or steel or something harder than that, all the vibrations from these constant hitting would go through your arm and it would jar your body instead. So this way the wood absorbs all of the shock of the impact of the glass. So when I need to shape them, just cut a bunch of them at one time so you don't have to keep getting up and down, but you can get really tiny, very precise cuts. And usually we do a whole batch of these down to the detail, and then we pick up a little pile of them and start placing them. And you can cut big pieces of glass. These when they come out of the kiln, they're large pizza-shaped pieces, and then they get cut down at the factory. But if I wanted to cut a big pizza from scratch to my own sizes, I would score it, and then I just hit it on this anvil thing, the hardy, and it would crack exactly where I made the score. So I prefer to work with the smaller pieces though, unless I'm doing something really artistic and I need larger chunks. So you get very, very tiny little pieces if you need them.
Very tiny.
Yeah. So, and then if the pieces are not the right shape exactly, then you kind of chip away at them this way. If they're not exactly perfect, if they have a corner that sticks out too much, you can kind of bite away, or nibble, they call it, nibbling away, just to make sure you get the proper shape. I've always liked puzzles, and I like the act of covering a surface with some kind of beautiful texture or something. So I enjoy the building up of the surface. I think that's why I like mosaic so much. A word that people use a lot when they see mosaic artists demonstrating their work is tedious, which is sort of insulting, but it's sort of true at the same time. And yes, it is tedious, and that word goes through my head a lot when I'm working. But if you can survive the tedium, you can come up with a really beautiful piece of artwork, and that's...
What in your life has taught you to be this patient with all this tedium? You just don't start from day one.
Probably other artworks that I worked on, puzzles, the cakes that I used to make are the same kind of thing. Labor intensive, lots of building up of surface, lots of patience of repetitive brush strokes and things like that. But I think if you have a creative bone, if you like to cook or you like to do woodworking or something, it's the same kind of repetitive thing. Carpentry, continually sanding and honing and shaping and sawing and nailing and that kind of thing. You have to have a focus on the craft of it, not in the arts and crafts sense, but in the actual verb to craft. You have to take pride in your work and make sure you do it right the first time, and if you don't do it right, rip it out and start over to make sure it's perfect, because there's nothing worse than finishing gluing down a mosaic and finding out, oh, if I hadn't been so lazy on that section, it would have flowed better and the pieces wouldn't look so awkward. So I try to really take my time and make sure I mean it when I'm putting a piece down, that that's the perfect piece for that perfect spot. Otherwise I'll be dissatisfied with it later, and no amount of compliments can ever convince me otherwise that it's a good work, because I'll always see the mistake in it. That's the perfectionist part of an artist. So yes, it does require patience. But writers have to have patience, poets, pianists, everyone has to have whatever patience it requires to be accomplished in their particular field. So generally when you cut, you do everything in halves. So it fractures better if you take a big piece, cut it in half, and then cut that one in half, and then cut the next one in half, as opposed to this method doesn't work well if you're trying to cut something into thirds or quarters. You have to halves and halves and halves. Otherwise, you end up with a bad fracture. And an odd thing about this kind of enameled glass is that some colors cut better than other colors, depending on the mineral content and what kind of chemicals went into forming that color. Some of them, like this one, it's crumbling and leaving a lot more shards and fractures than this color did. So there's something inertly in that citrus green glass, that the mineral content, that makes it want to fracture in a different way than the browns.